Hello, students. I'm going to show you how to fill in this holiday shopping spree percent shortcuts. Make sure your first and last name is at the top and you circle what class period you're in. Some of you have seen this first front side page, but some have not. So if you've seen it already and you have it copied down on your colored sheet, you may fast forward until you see when I move to the second page or the last part of this page. So for those who haven't seen this, we're looking at the fractions for each of these. And remember, percent means per 100. All right. So when we have per 100, we have a fraction and we want to make sure we write it over 100. Well, if you had 100 over 100, that is the same as 1 over 1. 50%, 50 per 100, we would reduce that to 1/2, right? You know that one. If we had 30%, that'd be 30 per 100. And if we saw 30 per 100, does anything reduce? Yes. So we go down and reduce down or simplify to 3/10. We all know that 25% is 25 out of 100, which reduces to 1/4. 10% would be 10 over 100. The zeros, one of each of the zeros cancel out. So we're left with 1 over 10. If we move down here, think of how many nickels are in a dollar or how many $5 bills are in $100 bill or $100. And we would know that would be 5 over 100 or reduces down to 1 over 20th. Now, if we look at that 1 over 2, notice 5. 1 over 2, 5, 0. Notice the zeros kind of flip there. It's kind of cool. And then 1% would be 1 per 100. All right. Now the decimal, remember our decimal to percent. And if I have a percent and I want to go back to a decimal, I go 1, 2 to the left. So I got to move my decimal point 1, 2 to the left. That would be 1. We could put 1.0, but that's a waste. We could just put 1, but so that we don't misunderstand what's going on there, we can leave that. 50%, I move it 1, 2. Don't forget that 0 up front. It'd be 0.5. Do we need a 0 after that? No. Unless we were talking money, we don't need it. Next, we would go 0.3. And hopefully you recall the importance of putting that 0 out in front so we don't miss that decimal point. We know numbers don't start with 0. So when we see that, we're like, wait a second, what's going on? Oh, it's a number less than 1. Always put that 0 there. This one would be 0.25 or 25 hundredths. Next, we move it over 2. We'd have 0 and 1/10. No 0 needed after that. Next, we'd have 0 and 5 hundredths, which would be 0.05. And then lastly, this decimal equivalent would be 0.01. And all I did was move my decimal point 1, 2, and I had to put a filler 0 there. Okay, hopefully you can see that. This next part is very important. You're going to refer back to this. You are actually going to be moving on to teaching someone else how to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this video. But we need to figure out, how do I find 100% of something? Well, that's pretty simple. And you can say it a bunch of different ways. But basically, it is the entire amount. Okay, so that's pretty simple enough. When I ask for 100% of something, that means you give me all of it, all right, the entire amount. When I'm asking for, or if I get a 50% off discount, well, you can divide by 2, but that implies that you need to do some division, some long division, not that tough. But really, another way of thinking of it, which is easier, is simply to cut the number in half. And we're going to look at some examples coming up here. Now, what we're going to do is jump from that 50% to 25%. Well, think about it. How do I go from 50% to 25%? Well, I cut it in half again. So I could say find 50% and cut in half, or we could just say cut in half twice. All right. That's the same as dividing by 4, but this is a little bit easier. If I wanted to, divide 32 and find 1/4 of that, I guess, divide it by 4, you can do that. That would be 8, and that works out nicely. But if I had 30, does 30 divide by 4 nicely? No. but I could cut 30 in half twice. Half of 30 is 15. Half of 15 is 7.5. So it's a little bit easier to think of it this way. Now, what you're going to go to next, and what you should do first, is find this one. I call this the building block. So this is the building block of percents. You're going to use this to find a bunch of different things. And to find 10% of a number is really easy. All you do is you move your decimal point 1 to the left. Okay? If I wanted to find 10% of, say, $100, I move my decimal point 1 to the left. That's $10. Let's say I had $50. What's 10% of $50? I just move my decimal point 1 to the left. That's $5. Let's say that I had $30. Well, what's 10% of $30? I move it over 1. It's $3. What about $25? 10%, move it over. 10% of $25 is 2.5 or $2.50. Okay, very easy. And once we find that, we can bounce up to 20%. If you needed to find 20% off of something, you would find 10%, double it. Well, what about 30%? Simple. I find my 10% by moving the decimal point 1 to the left, and then I triple it or multiply by 3. Okay, and there's a couple different ways you can do tripling. We'll see later on in class. Now, 5%. How is 5% related to that building block? Well, we cut it in half, right? So to find 5%, we need to find 10% and then cut it in half. And we'll look at some examples here in a second. Cut in half. Now, finally, notice 1% is like 10%, right? And even before that, 100% was like 10%. What I do to 100% to get to 10%, I moved it 1 decimal place to the left. How do I go from 100% to 1%? I move my decimal point 2 to the left. Okay, so here's the deal. You'll need to refer back to this. Hopefully with some practice, you're going to remember it, but this is something that's going to be very, very important. You're going to teach someone else to do this, and you're going to use it when you're finding the different percentages on this worksheet and on your project. Okay. All right, I went a little too far. So let's look at some of these examples. I have some simple numbers here. $100. I need to find 100% markup. Stores buy things. Let's say they bought it for $100. They need to sell it to make a little profit to pay their employees. So they're going to have 100% markup. Well, what is 100% of $100? Pretty simply, it's $100. Now, since it's a markup, I add these two together, and the final cost would be $200. Okay. How do I find 50% of a number? Well, I cut it in half. And what's half of 100? Well, it's pretty sweet, pretty simple, $50. Now, with a discount, I subtract. So what's 100? Take away $50? You would pay $50 if you were to save 50%. And it started at $100. Now, let's jump down to this one. How do I find 25%? Well, I cut it in half twice. So there's once, I cut that in half again, and lo and behold, pretty nice numbers. It's 25. But if it's a markup, what does that do? It adds to the original price. So now you might sell this thing for $125 if you bought it for $100 and had a 25% markup. Remember, now we're going to go to our building block, right? Don't forget that. How do I find 10% of a number? I move the decimal point over 1. So 10% of $100 would be $10. With a markup, I add these two. So it's $110. Let's go back up to this one. Now that I know 10% is $10, to find 30%, I triple it. So that would be $30. And if it was a discount, that means I would pay $70. Remember how we found 5%? You can look up above on your paper. It's pretty simple. You find 10% and then cut it in half. Well, I know 10% was $10. So simply enough, with this nice number, that'd be $5. If I had a discount, say at Target, you get a 5% discount. If you bought $100, your final cost would be $95. And then they'd probably add that 7% tax to it, which we're going to look at later. Next on this one, 1% of $100 would be simply $1. Since it's a markup, it would be $101. All right, now over here, again, the first thing you might do is go, what's 100% of $50? Well, 100% of $50 is the entire amount. That's $50. If I had a markup, that final cost would be $100. If I had initial price of $50, but they're marking it up 50%, well, what's 50% of $50? I cut it in half. That'd be $25. And since a markup, I add those two together. Those two add up to $75. Now let's jump to the 25%. That's a nice next step when we're doing all of these. So now 25%, I cut it in half once and then cut it in half again. Well, half of 25, you can break it down. What's half of 20? It's 10. And what's half of 5? 2.5. So this would be $12.50. Now you could have done $50 divided by 4, but does that come out nicely? No, we don't. 4 does not go into 50 nicely, but when I cut it in half 2 times, it does. Now that's a discount, so I need to take it away from 50, and I break it into parts. So I'm going to take 50, take away 10, that's 40. What's 40? Take away 2, 38. What's $38? Take away the 50 cents, and you would get $37.50 right there. Now let's go to the building block. What's 10% of 50? I move it over 1. That's simply $5. Since it's a discount, I subtract, right? Easy enough. We get $45. Now, once we found that 10%, we could bounce up to 30%, which I just need 3 of these. Well, that would be $15. And since it's a markup, we'd add that to the 50 and we would get $65. Finally, we move down to these two, all right? And again, 5% is based on the 10, but I cut it in half. So what's half of $5? Well, odd numbers are kind of tough sometimes, but you can do, what's the number right below it? 4, right? What's half of 4 and what's half of 1? Half of 4 is 2. Half of 1 would be 50. And since we're talking dollars and cents, I need that 50 cents. I need that 0. Okay. And markup, I would add them together. So I'd get $52.50. If by chance they offered a 1% discount, sometimes businesses do that. Hey, if you use this or do that, you save 1%. Well, 1% of $50 up here, it says, move my decimal point, 1, 2. So that would be 0.50. That's 50 cents. It's a discount, so I take that away from 50, and I would get $49.50. All right. Now to the back side. We're moving on to some variety of problems. Notice I don't have the 100% anymore, but we do have some of the simple ones that you can do. Let's say you want to buy something that's $900 and they're advertising, they're marking it up. For some reason, they might have bought it and they're trying to sell it for a profit. So there's a 50% markup. What would the price be that they're trying to sell that as? Well, what is 50% of 900? Can you cut 900 in half? And again, if you can't think of it as 800 plus 100. All right. What is 800 plus 100? 900. Can I do half of 800? You bet. Can I do half of 100? You bet. So this would be 450. Okay. And again, businesses do that. They buy something for 900, they mark it up. What is their selling costs going to be? Well, we'd add those two together and we get $1,350. Okay. Now we can go to 25 pretty simply. We cut this in half twice. We already know half of it is 450. What's half of 450? Hopefully you can do that in your head. 225. Okay. Now, since it's a discount now, we're going to subtract it. And let's do it in parts. Let's think of this as 200, 20, and 5. What's 900 take away 200? Hopefully you thought it was 700. What is 700 take away 20? 700 take away 20 would be 680. And what is 680 take away 5? That would be 675. With practice, I would hope you can do that. Now we go to that building block. What is 10% of 900? What do? I move it over 1. So 10% of 900 would be $90. Since it's a markup, they would sell that thing for $990. Okay. Now to go to 20%, just like 30% was triple, 20% would be doubled. So what is $90 doubled? Hopefully you can do that in your head. That'd be 18 with a 0, 180, but it's a discount. So I'd have to take 900 minus 100. You should have 800. What's 800 take away 80? 800 take away 80 should be $720. Now, going to 5%, remember you find 10%, which we know is $90, and we cut it in half. What's half of $90? Half of $90 should be $45. Since it's a markup, that would be $945. Simple enough. If I wanted to find 1% of that, I move it 1, 2, we get $9 is 1%. Okay. And if I had a discount, I'd take 9 away from 900 and I would get $891. Okay. Now, this is where we're going to use this trick we're going to use for tax. But let's say it was a 9%, in this case, markup. To find 9%, what I'm going to do is find 1% and take it times 9. Okay. See how I get that? 1% times 9 would give me 9%. So what's 1% of 900? We just found that. What is $9 times 9? You would get $81. Okay, so a 9% of that $900 would be $81. When I mark it up, I add it to it, so it'd be $981. Okay, again, when you're finding a single percent, you find 1% and then take it by whatever that number is. Pretty simple. All right, over here, what you might do is pause, and I want you to try and find your markup or discount amount. So find 50% of this, find 40% of that, 25% of that, so on and so forth. Find all that first. If you think you can do the discount or markup, do it. Find those. So pause the video, and then you can kind of play or fast forward. I will have the answers here in a second. So 50% of 400, I cut it in half. That'd be 200. Since it's a discount, I take it away. I save 50%. That means I pay per 50%, which is $200. Before I do 40%, let's jump down to 10%. What's 10% of a number? I move it over 1. That would be $40. Okay. I move it over one place, $40. That's 10%. If it's a markup, I add to it, so I get $440. Now I know 10%. How can I go to 40%? Well, how many 10% is going to 40%? Absolutely 4. So what am I going to do to the $40? I'm going to multiply it by 4. So this will be $160. Since it's a markup, I add it and I get $560. Now we could have done this 25%. Very simple. Remember, to find 25%, I could divide by 4. Does this one divide by 4 nicely? You bet it does. 400 divided by 4 is 100. Or I can cut it in half once and then cut it in half again. The dividing by 4 works if the number is divisible by 4. But if it isn't divisible by 4 nicely, you can cut it in half twice. Since it's a discount, we're going to save $100. So that would be $300 for your final cost. Now, how do we do 13%? Well, here's the deal. You could do 1% times 13, but do you know your 13 multiplication facts? Probably not. So what we can do is find 1 10% and then 3 1%. Okay? Notice if I had 1 10% or 1 dime and 3 pennies, would I have 13 cents? You bet. So now what's 10% of 400? 10% of 400 is 40. So I have 40. I can write it down right there. Now what's 1%? I move it 1, 2. 1% is 4, but I need 3 of those 4s. So that would be 12. What's 40 plus 12? Hopefully you got 52. So 13% of 400 is actually not too bad. We would find 10% and 3 1%. Again, move the decimal point, find 1%, multiply by 3, add those two together. Now it's a discount. So what is 400 take away 50? That's 350. What's 350 take away 2? 348. Hopefully that's what you got. A 7% markup on this one, since it's a single digit, I'm going to find 1% and I'm going to take it times 7. This is what you're going to do for your tax on the items you buy for your shopping trip. Okay, so I need to find 1%. I find 1% by moving it over 2. That's $4. But I need 7 of those. So what's $4 times 7? Hopefully you know your facts. It's 28. Since it's a markup and it's like tax, what do we do to that? Well, if I went in and bought something that was $400, I'd have to pay $28 in tax. My total with tax would be $428. Now, let's say they're offering a 4% discount. How do I find 4%? Well, I do 1% times 4. And 1% of this number, remember, we move it 1, 2 to the left. That's $4, but I need 4 of them. What's $4 times 4? We know our facts. We should know $16. Since it's a discount, I would do 400 take away 10. 400 take away 10 is 390. 390 take away 6 is 384. It's kind of glitching there. Sorry for the space. $384. All right, again, what I want you to do is take a break. I'm going to show you the answers. Oops, I went too far. Let's go back up. And I went too far. This is lagging behind. I'm sorry. And there we go. I want you to pause this video and try and answer all of these. Okay, so I'm just finding 50% of 76. I don't need to add or subtract it. Don't worry about the discount or markup. Hopefully you understand that. It's pretty simple. So pause the video and you're going to look at all of these answers. Okay, try and do all of them. If you don't understand how to do one, you can get back in the video and kind of fast forward and double check your answers as you go. All right, hopefully you understood how to do this. Remember, 50% is half. How do I find half of 76? Well, I can do half of 70 and half of 6. What's half of 7? Well, if you don't know half of 70, you can do half of 60 and half of 10, right? What's half of 60? 30. What's half of 10? 5. Half of 70 is 35. What's half of 6? 3. So that would be 38. And since we're talking dollars, we'd have $38. Now, 20% of 76, I need to first find 10%. How do I find 10%? I move my decimal point 1 to the left. That's $7.60, but I don't need one 10%. I need two 10%. So I need to double $7.60. What's $7 doubled? 14. What's 60 cents doubled? 60 cents and 60 cents. That's $1.20 plus your 14 would give you $15.20. Okay. How do I find 75%? Well, I could divide by 4, which implies some work, or cut it in half once. We just did that, 38. Now cut it in half again. What's half of 30 and half of 8? Half of 30 is 15. Half of 8 is 4. So you'd get 19. Okay. How do I find 10%? Well, we did that up here. 10% would be, just move that over. Simply $7.60. 60 cents, my bad. All right. Next, 5%. I do 10%, cut it in half. So I got to cut this in half. What's half of $7? Hopefully you know it's $3.50. Hold that in your brain right here. And then what's half of 60 cents? 30 cents plus the $3.50 would give you $3.80. Now notice this, 5% is 3.8, 50% was 38. Whoa, you're going to see some patterns like that. Next, I need to find 1% of 76, and this would be like if I wanted to find 8% or whatever percent. Okay, I can find 1% and multiply it by whatever that number is. 1%, I move it 1, 2 places over. So this would be 0.76 or 76 cents. All right. Now, remember how we do 13%? I made it the same number, so hopefully you can remember, but it works for 12%, works for 14%, works for 17%, could work for 21%, 22%. We'll look over here at 32%. I'm going to figure out what builds up to that in the most efficient way. And that would be 10%, which we know is 760. And then I need 3 1%. 1% was 76 cents. Okay. So you might do a little chicken scratching off to the side. It would be 760 plus what's 3 times 70 cents? 3 times 70 cents would be $2.10. What is 3 times 6 cents? Well, that would be 18 cents, right? If you had 3 sets of 6 pennies, that'd be 18 pennies. If you add all these up, we get 60, 70, 88, and that would be 9. So this would be $9.88. Okay. Minimal work. With practice, you might be able to do some of this in your head, although you can write down some of this. Okay. Now let's say we find something for $25 and we save 50%. Okay. Go ahead, do this on your own. Again, hopefully you did this, but 50% of $25 would be half of 20, half of 5. Half of 20 is 10, half of 5 is 250. Put those together, you get $12.50. Make sure you have that zero. Let's jump down to this one first and do 10% of 25. To find 10% of a number, I move it 1 to the left. So that would be simply $2.50. But if I want 4 of those, well, I need to find 4 of these. If I had 4 $2 and 4 50-cent pieces, how much money would I have? You would have $10. Okay. Next, 25%. Remember, that's related to the 50%. Can you cut $12.50 in half again? You bet. This one would be $6.25. Now, going to 5%, I find my 10% and I do what? Cut it in half. What's half of $2? 1. What's half of 50 cents? 25. Is that pretty simple? I think it is. I think you should be able to do this. Next, how would you find 1%, which is kind of the other building block? This helps you do a lot of the bigger ones. This helps you do the smaller ones or piece together ones. 1%, I move it 1, 2. This would be 25 cents. Okay. Now, to find 32%, that's kind of like, how can I make 32 cents? Well, you could do a quarter, a nickel, and 2 pennies, but that means you need to find this one, the 5%, which means you needed to find the 10% and then add the pennies. That's kind of cumbersome, but that works. I would say you would find 3 10%, 3 dimes, and then 2 1%. If I needed 3 10% to get to that 30, well, 10% was 250. So I need 250, 250, and 250. You could multiply that by 3, or you could double it once and then add it to itself. So doubled 250 would be 5. Added 250 to that 5 would be 750. Okay. Now that's the 3 10%. Now I need 2 1%. Well, 1% was 25 cents. I need how many of those? 2. 2 25 cents would be 50 cents. And when I add all that up, I get $8. Okay. And you did all that in your head without a calculator. Okay. So now here's the deal. I want you to do this on your own. This will be part of your practice for homework. A lot of easy ones. Remember, if you need to find 7%, you find 1% times 7. What if you needed to find 40% or 4%? Well, you can find 1% times 4. What about 35%? Couple different ways. You can do a 25% and a 10%, or you could do 3 10% and a 5%. Okay. That one, try it both ways. See if you get the right answer. Look at this number. Oh man, this one's kind of tough. To do this, we'd find 1% times 7. Well, here's the deal. Let's round this. This is that instance where if you have an ugly number, you're going to do a little rounding. Do the 1%, which is 1.65 times 7. And you can do that in pieces. What's 7 times $1? What's 7 times 60 cents? What's 7 times 5 cents? And you'll add up all those pieces. This one might be the most challenging one, but try all these. Do all these and see how it goes. Now, what your homework will be is you will have another colored piece of paper, which is called teaching percents. And for this teaching percent, you must find somebody to teach this trick to. It can be a family member, brother or sister that's third grade or higher. It could be a parent, could be a grandma, grandpa, could be cousin, could be a friend. It just can't be anybody also in the 7th grade at Horizon Middle School. And it can't be a teacher at school. Now, what if your parent is a teacher? You can teach them. You might already know it. This document is going to look like, let me find it here. We go here, we go projects, we go holiday shopping spree, percent shortcuts. This is the one that you will get a copy of. We will hand these out to you, but this is what it looks like, okay? You're going to have somebody else fill this out. This is going to be due at the beginning of math class on, we're going to go Monday, December 14th, okay? 2020. If it's a different year, I'll tell you a different date. You're going to have the person write down all the work. You're not writing it down. You're going to tell them, and they're going to write down, how do you find 100%, 50%, 10%? Tell them the importance of that one. And then how do you go to 30%, 5%? How do you base 25% off that 50? You're going to have them write in all of these. Remember, 7% is simply finding 1% and multiplying by 7. Now, ask them, and maybe they know this, maybe they're younger and they don't, but what does it mean if a price has a markup? What does that do to the price? What happens? What if it's a discount? You're going to have them work through these problems. If they struggle, help them out. Don't give them the answer. I should see their handwriting on this one. And then they're going to work through these problems. Again, you can help them if they need you to guide them. But if they're like, oh, yeah, that's pretty easy, just make sure they're doing it correctly and that they fill this all in. Your grade directly reflects how did they fill this in. If they didn't fill it all in, you're going to lose points. Then they're going to sign below and return the sheet by the due date. The person who you taught would say, I, so-and-so, certify that they'd put your name, has taught me the steps, and I've completed the above practice problems dealing with percents. That person's going to write their name. That person's going to do their signature, which is cursive, and then they're going to put the date, okay? Again, this will be due by the class time that I specify, which in this case would be December 14th, 2020. If it's a different year, it'll be possibly a different date. Okay, so this will be your future homework. Hopefully you understand everything. If not, ask somebody. They can't count it as teaching you, but it can count to help you.